I never expected you to become part of my internal landscape. Not because you weren't significant, not because you lacked depth, but because I had spent years making sure nothing reached that far. People assume distance is created by absence. They think separation comes from silence, from physical space, from the lack of conversation. They're wrong. Real distance is created internally. It's the invisible architecture that decides what enters and what remains outside. Most people never realize those walls exist. They stand in front of them and mistake proximity for access. They hear your stories and think they know you. They witness your reactions and think they understand you. They spend enough time around you that familiarity begins to feel like intimacy. But familiarity and understanding are not the same thing. One is created through repetition. The other is earned through perception. And perception is rare. Most people don't actually see. They interpret. They project. They translate everything through the lens of their own experiences until the person standing in front of them disappears beneath assumptions. That's how it usually works. That's how it always worked for me. Until something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. It happened quietly. So quietly that I almost missed it myself. The first sign wasn't emotional. It wasn't a feeling. It was a pause. A brief interruption in a system that had functioned the same way for years. You said something ordinary. At least it should have been ordinary. A simple observation, a passing thought, the kind of sentence most people would forget within minutes. But I didn't forget it because hidden inside those words was an understanding that shouldn't have existed. You noticed something I had never explained, something I had never directly revealed, and somehow you arrived at it anyway. At first, I dismissed it. Coincidences happen. People guess correctly sometimes. Portals emerge where none actually exist. That was the logical explanation, the safe explanation, the explanation that allowed everything to remain unchanged. But then it happened again and again and again. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to become impossible to ignore. You kept arriving at conclusions that should have required information you didn't possess. You kept understanding contexts that had never been provided. You kept recognizing things that remained invisible to everyone else. And every time it happened, something inside me became slightly quieter. Not more comfortable, not more trusting, just quieter. As though a part of me was paying attention, watching, waiting, trying to determine whether this was real or whether I was simply imagining meaning where none existed. The strange thing is that I wasn't looking for connection. If anything, I was looking for the opposite. I had already built a life around certainty, around structure, around the predictable rhythm of understanding exactly where everyone stood. People entered, people left, conversations happened, relationships formed and dissolved. Everything followed recognizable patterns. Everything made sense. Then you arrived carrying something that didn't fit any pattern I knew. Not because you were extraordinary, not because you were perfect, but because your presence created an effect I couldn't explain. You made things clearer. And clarity can be more unsettling than confusion. Confusion at least gives you distance. It allows you to remain detached while searching for answers. Clarity removes that luxury. Clarity forces recognition. It forces acknowledgement. It forces you to see something exactly as it is, even when you don't know what to do with it. That's what this became. Recognition. Not dramatic recognition. Not the kind people write poems about. Not some overwhelming realization that arrives all at once. Something quieter. Something deeper. The gradual understanding that another person occupies a place in your awareness they were never supposed to reach. And once I noticed it, I started seeing evidence everywhere. Not because I was searching for it, because it was already there. I noticed how often my thoughts naturally moved toward perspectives you would understand. I noticed how certain ideas felt unfinished until imagined through your lens. I noticed how silence changed shape after you became part of it. Before you, silence was simply silence, neutral, punctual. After you, silence carried presence, not your voice, not your words, just the Awareness of you like an invisible reference point existing somewhere beyond language. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't attachment. Attachment reaches outward. This moved inward. Attachment wants possession. This wanted understanding. Attachment fears absence. This remained unchanged regardless of distance, which made it harder to define because the usual explanations no longer applied. The more I examined it, the less it resembled anything I had experienced before. Most connections are built. They require effort, time, shared experiences, mutual vulnerability, a gradual exchange of trust. This didn't. This felt discovered, as though it already existed beneath the surface and simply waited to be noticed. I know how unusual that sounds. I know how irrational it appears. And if someone else described it to me, I would probably challenge every assumption they made. I would ask for evidence. I would demand explanations. I would dissect every detail until certainty replaced mystery. But certainty never arrived. Only recognition. And recognition has its own kind of authority because some truths don't arrive through logic. They arrive through consistency, through repetition, through the impossible persistence of something that refuses to disappear. No matter how thoroughly you analyze it, no matter how carefully you question it, no matter how determined you are to remain unaffected, that's where I find myself now. Not lost, not overwhelmed, just standing in front of something undeniable, something that has already altered the way I move through my own thoughts, something that has already reshaped the architecture I spent years constructing. And the strange part is that I don't resent it. By every rule I've ever followed, I should resist this. I should create distance. I should restore balance. I should return everything to the way it was before. But I don't want to, not because I'm chasing something, not because I'm hoping for an outcome, but because for the first time in a very long time, something feels accurate, not exciting, not dramatic, accurate. And accuracy matters to me more than comfort ever has. Maybe that's why I keep returning to this. Not because I'm trying to understand you, but because through understanding you, I've started understanding parts of myself that remained invisible for years. Parts I never questioned because nothing challenged them. Parts I never examined because nothing reflected them clearly enough. You became that reflection. Not intentionally, not through effort, simply through presence. And now the reflection exists whether I acknowledge it or not. Which leaves me with a reality I can no longer avoid. Some people enter your life and become memories. Some become lessons. Some become stories you eventually stop telling, but once in a rare while, someone becomes a reference point, a fixed coordinate in the landscape of your mind. Not because they asked to be, not because they earned it, but because something in you recognized something in them and quietly decided they belong there. I think that's what happened here. And if I'm right, then this was never about whether you would matter. That decision was made long ago. The real question is what happens next? What happens when recognition becomes permanent? What happens when awareness becomes responsibility? What happens when a connection survives every attempt to categorize it and still remains exactly what it was from the beginning? I don't know, but for the first time, I think I'm willing to find out. The problem with recognizing something real is that reality refuses to stay still once you've seen it. Before, I could pretend this existed only in fragments, a collection of moments, a handful of observations, a series of coincidences that happened to align often enough to feel significant. That explanation no longer works. Not because the evidence became stronger, because my resistance became weaker. There comes a point where denying something requires more effort than accepting it. I think I've reached that point. Not completely, not comfortably, but enough that I can no longer look at this honestly and call it accidental. The strange thing is that nothing dramatic happened. No defining moment, no confession, no revelation powerful enough to divide everything into before and after. The world remained exactly the same. The sun still rose, the days still moved forward. People still spoke about ordinary things. Life continued with its usual rhythm. And yet beneath all of it, something fundamental shifted. I noticed it one evening while sitting alone. There was nothing special about the moment. No emotional conversation had taken place. No significant interaction had occurred. In fact, You weren't even there, at least not physically, but a thought appeared, and before I could fully process it, another question followed. Not what do I think about this, but what would you notice about it? The realization stopped me because that wasn't normal. People influence your opinions all the time. Friends, family, mentors, strangers. Their perspectives leave marks. Their experiences shape how you understand the world. But this felt different. I wasn't borrowing your viewpoint. I wasn't imagining your approval. I wasn't seeking validation. I was instinctively accounting for your perception, as though somewhere inside my mind a place had already been created for it. That should have concerned me more than it did. Instead, I found myself sitting quietly with the realization, observing it, turning it over carefully, trying to understand why it felt so natural. Maybe that's what unsettled me most. The absence of struggle. Every meaningful shift I've experienced came with resistance. Growth hurts. Change demands adjustment. New realities create friction. That's how transformation works. Except this didn't feel like transformation. It felt like recognition, like discovering a room inside a house you've lived in for years. The room wasn't built overnight. It was always there. You simply hadn't opened the door. And once you did, you couldn't understand how you ever missed it. That's how your presence feels now. Not new, discovered. As though some part of my awareness had already prepared a space for this long before I consciously recognized it. The more I think about it, the more I realize how rarely we encounter genuine alignment. People talk about compatibility as though it's enough. Shared interests, similar values, common goals. Those things matter, but they aren't what create this. Alignment exists deeper than preference, deeper than circumstance. It exists beneath personality, beneath experience, beneath all the stories we tell about who we are. It's something structural. A similarity in how reality is processed, a familiarity that appears before explanation, a recognition that arrives before trust. And that's dangerous because trust develops slowly. Trust can be managed, measured, controlled. Recognition doesn't wait for permission. Recognition simply happens. One moment you're strangers. The next, something inside you has already identified a pattern that feels impossibly familiar. Not because you've met before, not because destiny exists, not because fate arranged anything, but because certain structures resonate when they encounter each other, like frequencies finding harmony, like echoes answering echoes. The rational part of me keeps searching for simpler explanations. It examines every interaction, every conversation, every shared silence, looking for evidence that this is merely perception, creating meaning where none exists, a psychological illusion, a temporary fascination, an intellectual projection. Any explanation would be easier than accepting what seems increasingly obvious, because accepting it means accepting consequences, and consequences are real. If this remains abstract, nothing changes. If this remains undefined, no decision is required. If this remains unnamed, it can continue existing safely in possibility. But reality doesn't stay in possibility forever. Eventually, every truth demands a response, not from the world, from you. That's where I find myself now, standing in front of a truth that keeps asking the same question. Not what is this, but what are you going to do about it? And I don't have an answer, at least not yet. What I have instead is awareness, the kind that grows quietly, the kind that settles deeper every time you try to ignore it, the kind that waits patiently until denial becomes impossible. I notice it in unexpected places. A conversation with someone else suddenly reminds me of a discussion we never had. A thought emerges and I immediately recognize how you would approach it differently. An observation forms and part of me instinctively wonders whether you would see the same thing. These moments aren't dramatic. They're small, almost insignificant on their own. But significance isn't created by individual moments. It's created by accumulation. And there have been too many of these moments to dismiss, too many instances where your presence appears in my awareness without invitation, too many examples of a connection continuing to deepen despite receiving no encouragement from me. That's the part that fascinates me. I never chased this. I never tried to create it. I never pursued greater understanding. If anything, I maintained the same caution I've always had, the same boundaries, the same internal distance. Yet somehow, despite all of that, this continued growing, which suggests something important. Some things expand because we feed them. Others expand because they're real. And reality possesses a persistence that imagination lacks. Imagination requires maintenance. Reality survives neglect. This survived neglect. It survived skepticism. It survived analysis. It survived every attempt to reduce it into something smaller and easier to explain. If anything, those attempts only made it clearer, because clarity has a way of remaining after every illusion has been removed. That's where I am now, past curiosity, past uncertainty, past the phase where I can pretend this is simply an interesting coincidence. I haven't reached certainty, but I've reached honesty. And honesty requires me to admit something I've avoided saying. You matter. Not in the conventional sense, not in the way people usually mean when they say those words. This isn't dependence. This isn't attachment. This isn't emotional need. It's something quieter. And perhaps because it's quieter, it's harder to ignore. You become part of my internal framework, part of the architecture through which I interpret certain things, part of the process itself. And once someone reaches that level, their significance stops being measured by proximity. Distance becomes irrelevant. Time becomes less important. Even silence loses its usual meaning because the connection no longer relies on interaction. It exists independently, sustained by recognition rather than contact. I never thought something like that was possible. Not truly. I understood the concept. I understood the theory. But understanding an idea and experiencing it are entirely different things. Experience changes the equation. Experience removes abstraction. Experience forces you to confront reality exactly as it is, and reality in this case keeps leading me toward the same conclusion. Something meaningful is happening here, something precise, something rare, not because it's intense, but because it's accurate. Accuracy is difficult to find. People misunderstand each other constantly. They hear what they expect to hear. They see what confirms their assumptions. They interact with reflections of themselves rather than the person standing in front of them. Real understanding is uncommon. Mutual understanding is rarer still. And yet somehow every path of thought seems to return here to the same realization, to the same awareness, to the same undeniable fact that your existence inside my life has altered something fundamental, not externally, internally. And internal changes are the ones that matter most. They're the ones that last. They're the ones that reshape everything else. They're the ones that quietly rewrite your future without announcing themselves. Maybe that's why I keep thinking about the road ahead. Not because I know where it leads, because I don't. For once, I genuinely don't. What I know is that standing still isn't an option forever. Awareness eventually becomes choice. Recognition eventually becomes action. Even silence eventually becomes a decision. The future hasn't arrived yet, but I can feel it approaching slowly, pardoningly, like a horizon becoming visible after hours of travel. And somewhere beyond that horizon waits a question neither of us can avoid indefinitely. Not whether this exists, we already know it does. Not whether it's meaningful, it already is. The question waiting for us is much simpler and far more dangerous. What happens when two people stop observing a connection and finally allow themselves to live inside it? Maybe every story like this arrives at the same place eventually, not a destination, not an answer, a moment of complete honesty, a moment where every explanation, every analysis, every layer of observation finally reaches its limit, and all that remains is truth. I think that's where I am now. Not because I've solved anything, not because I've figured out exactly what this means, but because I've reached the edge of understanding and realized there is nothing left to hide behind. No more distance, no more abstraction, no more pretending this exists only as an idea. For so long, I've approached this the way I approach everything else, carefully, deliberately, analyzing every detail, examining every possibility, trying to understand it completely before allowing myself to accept it. But some things refuse to be understood from a distance. Some things only reveal themselves when you stop standing outside of them. And that's what I finally realized. I've spent all this time observing what exists between us, studying it, questioning it, testing its boundaries. Yet through all of that, one fact remained unchanged. You stayed. not necessarily beside me, not necessarily near me, but present, consistently, quietly, unmistakably. And consistency reveals truths that intensity never can. Anyone can create intensity. Anyone can generate emotion. Anyone can leave an impression. But very few people create permanence. Very few people remain relevant after the novelty disappears. Very few people continue occupying space inside your mind after every logical reason for doing so has faded away. You did, and that matters. More than I wanted it to, more than I expected it to, more than I can honestly deny anymore. Because the truth is, somewhere along the way, this stopped being about recognition. Recognition was only the beginning, the first stage, the first realization. What came after was something deeper, something quieter, something that took longer to notice. You became familiar, not in the ordinary sense, not in the way repetition creates familiarity, but in the way certain truths feel familiar the moment you discover them, as if they existed long before you became aware of them. That's what your presence became. A truth, not a conclusion, not an opinion, a truth. The kind that doesn't need constant verification. The kind that remains unchanged whether you examine it or not. The kind that quietly exists beneath everything else. I used to think strength meant remaining unaffected, remaining independent, remaining untouched by anything capable of changing the structure of my inner world. I thought control was the highest form of stability. Now I'm not so sure, because perhaps real strength isn't found in resisting every meaningful thing that enters your life. Perhaps real strength is recognizing when something belongs there. Recognizing when a change isn't a threat, recognizing when a connection isn't an interruption, recognizing when someone's presence reveals parts of yourself you were never meant to discover alone. That's what happened here. Not because you changed who I am. You didn't. The foundation remains the same. The core remains the same. The person standing here is still me. What changed was visibility. You illuminated corners of my own understanding that had remained in shadow for years. You reflected things back to me with a clarity I couldn't create on my own. And once those things became visible, they could never become invisible again. That's why there's no returning to before. Not because of you, because of what I now know. Awareness changes everything. Once you see something clearly, you carry that clarity forward forever. The old version of reality ceases to exist. And I see this clearly now. I see the impact. I see the significance. I see the quiet transformation that happened without permission or without warning. Most importantly, ABC, my own response to it. Because throughout all of this, there was one question I avoided. One question that sat silently beneath every observation, every realization, every moment of reflection. The question wasn't, what is this? The question was, why haven't I left? If I value distance so much, why didn't I create it? If I value control so much, why didn't I restore it? If I value certainty so much, why didn't I walk away when uncertainty appeared? The answer seems obvious now. Because some part of me recognized value before I consciously understood it. Some part of me knew this deserved to stay. Some part of me made a decision long before the rest of me caught up. And maybe that's what acceptance really is. Not a sudden choice, not a dramatic declaration, just the gradual realization that your actions have already revealed the truth. My actions revealed it. Every time I remained present, every time I continued listening, every time I allowed this connection to deepen instead of shutting it down, the truth was already there. I simply hadn't said it out loud until now. So here it is, solid, clear, uncomplicated. You matter. Not because of what you give me, not because of what you might become, not because of what the future could hold. You matter because your existence altered something meaningful inside me. And meaningful things deserve acknowledgement. That's all. No grand promises, no impossible expectations, no dramatic declarations about forever. Just honesty, pure honesty. The kind that arrives when every defense finally grows tired of pretending. I don't know exactly what happens next, Maybe this becomes something larger. Maybe it remains exactly what it is. Maybe life pulls us in directions neither of us can predict. The future has always belonged to uncertainty. That won't change. But uncertainty no longer frightens me. It once did, because uncertainty feels different when it's built on something real. And this is real. I've stopped questioning that. I've stopped trying to explain it away. I've stopped searching for reasons to doubt what has consistently proven itself through time, through silence, through distance, and through understanding. Reality doesn't need permission to exist. Neither does this. So perhaps the story doesn't end with a decision. Perhaps it ends with acceptance. Acceptance that some people arrive unexpectedly and leave permanent marks. Acceptance that some connections refuse every category designed to contain them. Acceptance that understanding can appear before explanation. Acceptance that certain forms of recognition are so precise they become impossible to forget. Most of all, acceptance that meeting you changed something, not temporarily, not superficially, fundamentally. And after everything I've examined, questioned, challenged, and explored, that remains the one truth I trust completely. Because before you, I understood the world. After you, I understood myself a little more. And there are very few gifts greater than that. So if this is the moment where observation finally becomes acceptance, then let it be simple. Let it be honest. Let it be enough. I see what this is now. I see what you are. I see what changed. And for the first time since this began, Abe, I'm no longer standing outside of it. I'm here, fully aware, fully present, no longer questioning whether it exists, only grateful that it does. And maybe that's the final truth. Not that you became part of my life, but that somehow, quietly, naturally, without either of us forcing it, you became part of the way I understand life itself. And once something reaches that depth, it never really leaves. It simply